A family photo from 1930 captured something that no one noticed for almost a century, until today. Dr. Marcus Webb had spent the better part of 15 years surrounded by forgotten faces. As the head archivist at the DuSable Museum of African American History in Chicago, he had digitized thousands of photographs, each one a window into lives that history had tried to erase. On this particular October morning in 2024, the autumn light filtered through his office window as he worked through a collection donated by the estate of a deceased Southside resident. The photograph appeared unremarkable at first, just another family portrait from the 1930s. The image showed the Harris family posed in their living room, a father standing tall in a pressed suit, a mother seated with perfect posture in a floral dress, and 3 children arranged between them, their Sunday best. Their dignity captured in sepia tones. Marcus had seen hundreds like it. He placed the photograph on the high-resolution scanner, a piece of equipment capable of capturing details invisible to the naked eye. The machine hummed as it worked, and Marcus turned to enter metadata into his computer. Harris family, Chicago, circa 1930-1935. Routine work. Necessary work, but routine nonetheless. When the digital image appeared on his screen, Marcus leaned back in his chair and took a sip of his now cold coffee. He zoomed in to check the image quality, scanning across the faces first. The father, James Harris, according to the handwritten note on the back, had a strong jawline and eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. Ruth Harris, the mother, wore an expression of composed grace, though something about the tightness around her mouth suggested tension. Marcus was about to approve the scan when something caught his eye. In the background, hanging on the wall behind the family, was an oval mirror with an ornate wooden frame. It was positioned at an angle, reflecting part of the room. He zoomed in further, adjusting the contrast and brightness. His hand froze on the mouse. The reflection showed James Harris from behind, and his hands were clearly bound together at the wrists with what appeared to be rope. Marcus blinked hard, certain his eyes were playing tricks after hours of screen time. He zoomed in even closer, his heart beginning to pound. There was no mistaking it. The man, standing so stoically in the photograph, facing the camera with apparent calm, had his hands tied behind his back. "That's impossible," Marcus whispered to the empty office. He sat back, his mind racing. What he had interpreted as formal stiffness now looked like barely controlled terror. The mother's hands, he noticed, were gripping the shoulders of the youngest child with enough force that her knuckles appeared white, even in the old photograph. He looked at the handwritten note again. Harris family, 3247, South State Street, Chicago, May 1932. Marcus pulled out his phone and took a photo of his computer screen, sending it to his colleague, Dr. Patricia Foster. His message was brief. "Ever seen anything like this? Call me when you can." His phone buzzed immediately. Patricia's response: "My office, 20 minutes." Dr. Patricia Foster's office was a controlled chaos of historical documentation. Stacks of books lined every available surface, and the walls were covered with maps of Chicago's Black Belt from various decades. At 63, Patricia had spent her entire career studying African Americans in northern cities during the early 20th century. Marcus found her already examining the image on her own screen. She didn't look up when he entered, her eyes fixed on the mirror's reflection. "Close the door," she said quietly. Marcus did as instructed and took a seat. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Patricia finally sat back, removing her reading glasses. When she looked at him, her expression was grave. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "Estate donation. I was doing routine cataloging when I noticed the reflection." Patricia put her glasses back on and zoomed in on different sections. The address, 3247 South State Street. That was in the heart of Bronzeville. 1932 was a particularly volatile time in Chicago. "The Depression," Marcus offered. "Yes, but more than that." Patricia pulled up a map on her second monitor. By 1932, African Americans were confined to specific neighborhoods through restrictive covenants and violence. The police force was almost entirely white, and corruption was rampant. She pointed to the photograph. "Look at how they're dressed. Sunday clothes, probably their best. The room is clean, organized. They were expecting this photograph to be taken." Marcus leaned forward. "But then why are his hands tied?" "That is what we need to find out." She began typing rapidly, pulling up census records. "Harris is a common name, but with an address and date, we can narrow it down." The census record appeared. "Here, James Harris, age 34, occupation porter. Wife Ruth, age 32, domestic worker. 3 children, Robert, 12, Thomas, 8, and Dorothy, 5. "What about the photographer?" Patricia zoomed in on the bottom corner where a small embossed mark was visible. "Studio mark, E. Morrison, portrait photography, 47th Street. Elijah Morrison was one of the few black photographers in Bronzeville at the time." She pulled up newspaper archives from the Chicago Defender. Headlines from spring 1932 painted a grim picture. "Police brutality claims continue. Merchant attacked, suspects unknown." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. You think the police did this? During this period, black families lived under constant threat. Police raids were common, often without warrants. If a family witnessed something they weren't supposed to see, Patricia trailed off. So someone tied James Harris up and forced the family to pose? Intimidation took many forms. Making someone participate in a facade while under duress, that's psychological torture. Marcus studied the image again. The mirror is positioned deliberately, almost like it was placed there specifically. Patricia nodded. If Morrison knew what was happening, maybe he intended to preserve evidence. She began making notes. We need to find everything about Morrison, police records from 1932, and descendants who might know the story. The Chicago Public Library's Special Collections Room had the hushed atmosphere of a sacred space. Marcus sat at a long wooden table covered with boxes of microfilm reels, each containing months of the Chicago Defender from 1932. Patricia was 2 floors above, working through property records. They had been searching for 3 days. Marcus threaded another reel into the reader, his eyes strained from hours of scanning. The Defender had been meticulous in covering the black community, reporting incidents that mainstream papers ignored. He had learned to recognize coded language. Disturbance often meant police violence. Investigation frequently meant harassment. He was halfway through April 1932 when a headline caught his attention. South State Street merchant attacked, suspects flee scene. The article was brief, tucked between advertisements. Mr. Samuel Green, proprietor of Green's General Store at 3251 South State Street, was discovered badly beaten in his establishment on the evening of April 18th. Witnesses report seeing 2 white men fleeing the scene. Police have yet to make arrests. Marcus's pulse quickened. 3251. South State, just 4 doors from the Harris address. He noted the date and continued scrolling. 2 weeks later, Southside merchant succumbs to injuries. Samuel Green had died on May the 2nd, 1932. Marcus called Patricia immediately. I found something. A merchant 4 doors from the Harris address was beaten to death in April 1932. Witnesses saw 2 white men fleeing. I'm coming down. Minutes later, they hunched over the reader together. Patricia had brought her notebook. Look at this. Samuel Green owned his building, both store and apartment. That was rare for black business owners. Why does that matter? Property ownership in Bronzeville was a source of constant conflict. White real estate interests wanted control, and successful black owners were obstacles. She tapped her notes. I also found something in police records, or rather, what wasn't there. No arrest records related to Green's murder. No investigation reports. The case simply disappeared. Marcus felt cold. 2 white men flee a murder scene. Multiple witnesses and no arrests. It gets worse. Patricia pulled out a photocopy of a church ledger. This is from Bethel AME Church. Look at the entry for May 15th, 1932. Marcus read, Farewell gathering for the Harris family, James, Ruth, Robert, Thomas, and Dorothy departing for Detroit. They left 2 weeks after Green died, Marcus said softly. Patricia nodded. And the house at 3247 was empty by June. They vanished from Chicago's records. Marcus sat back. What if James Harris witnessed Green's murder? What if he saw those 2 white men? And if they were police officers, Patricia added, it would explain why there were no arrests. They looked at the photograph again on Patricia's tablet. The date on the back, May 1932. This was taken right before they left Chicago. We need to find Elijah Morrison's records, Marcus said, and we need to know what happened to the Harris family after they left. Onyx. Finding information about Elijah Morrison proved more difficult than Marcus had anticipated. The photographer's studio on 47th Street had closed in 1941, and most of his records had been lost to time. But Patricia had connections throughout Chicago's historical community, and on the 5th day of their investigation, she received a call that changed everything. Morrison's granddaughter is still alive, Patricia told Marcus, her voice excited. Her name is Clara. She's 87 and lives in Hyde Park. She's willing to talk to us. They drove to Clara Morrison's apartment the next morning. She lived in a modest building near the university, surrounded by books and framed photographs. Clara herself was a striking woman with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. My grandfather never threw anything away, Clara said, leading them to a spare bedroom converted into storage. After he died in 1965, my mother kept all his business records. Said they were important, though she never explained why. She pulled out several boxes labeled with years. 1932 would be in here. Marcus and Patricia carefully went through ledgers, client lists, and appointment books. Morrison had kept meticulous records, names, addresses, dates, payment amounts. On May 12, 1932, there was an entry. Harris family, 3247 S. State Saint, 2 RPM, $3.50. He was scheduled to photograph them, Marcus said. Claire was watching them carefully. What's this about? You said it was important. Patricia showed her the photograph on her tablet, zooming in on the mirror's reflection. Clara's hand went to her mouth. "My grandfather told me a story once," she said slowly. "I was maybe 15. He said that being a photographer meant bearing witness, and sometimes that witness came with a terrible price." She sat down heavily. "He said there was a family he photographed once, and he knew they were in danger. He said he tried to capture the truth in the only way he could without getting them all killed." Marcus felt his heart racing. "Did he say what happened to them?" "He said they escaped. That was the word he used. Escaped. And he said the photograph he took was evidence, but evidence no one would see for a very long time." Clara looked at the image again. "Is this it? Is this the photograph?" "We think so," Patricia said gently. "Your grandfather positioned the mirror to capture what was happening behind the camera. James Harris's hands were bound." Clara nodded slowly. "Grandfather said men came to his studio a few days after that session. Police officers. They demanded the negative. He told them he'd already given the family their prints and destroyed the negative, which was his usual practice for privacy." "But he didn't," Marcus said. "No, he kept it hidden. He said someday it might matter." Clara stood and went to a filing cabinet, pulling out a large envelope. "After he died, I found this with a note saying to keep it safe. I never knew why." She handed the envelope to Marcus. Inside was a glass negative, perfectly preserved. With the original negative in hand, Marcus and Patricia were able to create an even clearer image of the photograph. The enhanced version revealed details they hadn't seen before. The strain in James Harris's shoulders, a bruise visible on his left cheek, and most importantly, through the window behind the family, the partial view of a police vehicle parked outside. "They were still there," Patricia said, studying the image. "The police were right outside when this photo was taken." Marcus examined the appointment book again. Morrison was scheduled for 2 p.m. But look at this notation in the margin. Arrived 1:45 p.m. Situation unclear. Proceeded with caution. "He knew something was wrong the moment he arrived," Patricia said. They had also found something else in Morrison's records, a small journal where he occasionally made personal notes. The entry for May 12, 1932 was longer than most. "Arrived at Harris residence for scheduled portrait. 2 police vehicles outside. Officers inside home. Family dressed and waiting, but atmosphere tense. Father's hands bound, though positioned to hide this from direct view. Mrs. Harris asked me to proceed with photograph exactly as planned." Her emphasis on those words deliberate. Positioned mirror to capture reflection. Officers watched but did not interfere. Seemed to want a photograph taken as proof of normal family. Left quickly after session. Fear for this family's safety. A second entry, dated May 16th. Learned Harris family departed Chicago. Officers came to studio demanding negative. Told them it was destroyed per usual practice. They did not believe me but had no proof. Kept negative hidden. Someday this evidence may matter. Marcus sat back. Morrison understood exactly what he was documenting. He created evidence of coercion while making it look like he was complying. But why did the police want this photograph taken in the first place? Patricia wondered. If they were intimidating the family, why create any record at all? Marcus thought about it. Insurance. If the Harris family ever tried to report what happened, the police could produce this photograph showing a happy, well-dressed family. Who would believe claims of violence when this image existed? Except Morrison outsmarted them, Patricia said. He gave them their insurance while simultaneously creating evidence against them. The question now was what had the Harris family witnessed that made them such a threat. They returned to the newspaper archives, this time looking more carefully at the Samuel Green murder. In a small article from April 20th, they found something they'd missed before. Mr. Green's nephew, Joseph, stated that his uncle had recently refused to sell his property to unnamed buyers and had received threats. Patricia pulled up property records again. Look at this. In June 1932, a month after Green's death and the Harris family's departure, Green's building was sold to a real estate company, Southside Development Corporation. She dug deeper. Southside Development was a front company. The actual owners were... She paused, her face grim. 3 Chicago police officers and a city alderman. Marcus felt sick. They wanted his property. When he refused to sell, they killed him. And James Harris witnessed it, Patricia finished. Maybe he saw the actual murder, or maybe he saw the officers leaving the scene. Either way, he became a liability. So they terrorized his family and forced them out of Chicago, Marcus said. And they tried to make sure there would be no evidence of what they'd done. They sat in silence, the weight of the discovery settling over them. This wasn't just a historical mystery. It was evidence of corruption and murder that had been successfully buried for 92 years. We need to find out what happened to the Harris family after they left, Patricia said finally. Did they make it safely to Detroit? Did they ever tell their story? Marcus nodded. And we need to find their descendants, They deserved to know the truth about what their family endured. Tracing the Harris family after their departure from Chicago proved challenging. Detroit in the 1930s had been a destination for thousands of black families fleeing the South and seeking work in the automotive industry. Census records showed hundreds of families with the surname Harris living in Detroit by 1940. Patricia started with church records. Bethel AME in Chicago noted they were leaving for Detroit. Black families moving to new cities, almost always connected with churches first. It was how you found community, housing, jobs. She contacted several AME churches in Detroit, and on the third try, found a breakthrough. St. Paul AME Church in Detroit's Black Bottom neighborhood had membership records going back to the 1920s. A historian at the church searched their archives and found an entry from June 1932. New members, James and Ruth Harris, with children Robert, Thomas, and Dorothy, transferred from Bethel AME, Chicago. They made it, Marcus said, relief evident in his voice. The church records provided an address, 417 Hastings Street. Using Detroit city directories, they traced the family through the 1930s and 1940s. James had found work at the Ford River Rouge plant. The children attended local schools. By all appearances, they had built a new life. But Marcus noticed something odd in the records. Look at this. In 1935, Ruth Harris began using her maiden name, Ruth Coleman, and the children's school records after 1936 list them as Robert Coleman, Thomas Coleman, and Dorothy Coleman. They changed their names, Patricia said, or at least started using different ones. They were still hiding, Marcus realized. Even 3 years later, hundreds of miles away, they were still afraid. Patricia found Robert Coleman in Detroit's 1940 census. He was 18, working as a mechanic's apprentice. By 1942, military records showed he had enlisted in the Army. Thomas appeared in a 1943 high school yearbook. Dorothy's name appeared in a 1944 church newsletter, singing in the youth choir. They survived, Patricia said softly. They rebuilt their lives. Marcus continued searching through Detroit records. In 1955, he found a death certificate for James Harris, age 57. Cause of death, heart attack. The informant listed on the certificate was Robert Coleman, identified as his son. Ruth lived longer. Marcus found her death certificate from 1971, age 71. She had spent her final years living with her daughter Dorothy. We need to find the children, Marcus said. Or their children. Someone in this family must still be alive. Patricia was already searching. Thomas Coleman had died in 1998 in Detroit, survived by 2 daughters. Dorothy had moved to Cleveland in the 1960s and died there in 2003, leaving 3 children. Robert was harder to trace. Military records showed he had served in Europe during World War II, but after 1946, he seemed to disappear from Detroit records entirely. Wait, Patricia said, pulling up a different database. Robert Coleman, Army veteran, received a land grant in 1948. Location? Rural Wisconsin. She found him in Wisconsin census records. He had married in 1947, had 4 children, and worked as a carpenter. He had died in 2010, but his obituary listed survivors, 3 children and 7 grandchildren. One of his children still lives at the family address in Wisconsin, Patricia said. Daniel Coleman, age 65. I have a phone number. Marcus looked at her. We should call him. That evening, Marcus dialed the number with trembling hands. The phone rang 3 times before a man answered. Hello? Is this Daniel Coleman? Yes. Who's calling? My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I'm a historian at the DuSable Museum in Chicago. I'm calling about your father, Robert Coleman, or rather, Robert Harris. There was a long silence. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice cautious. How do you know that name? I found a photograph, Marcus said. From 1932, your grandfather's hands were bound. I think your family has been carrying a secret for a very long time, and I think it's time that secret was finally told. Another silence. Then, can you come to Wisconsin? I think we need to talk in person. Daniel Coleman lived on a rural property outside of Madison, Wisconsin. The house was modest but well-maintained, surrounded by tall pines. When Marcus and Patricia arrived on a cold November morning, Daniel was waiting on the porch, a tall man with graying hair and his grandfather's strong jawline. Come in, he said simply. Inside, the house was warm and filled with photographs. Daniel led them to a dining room table where he had already laid out several old photo albums and a wooden box. My father died 14 years ago, Daniel began. Before he passed, he gave me this box and made me promise to keep it safe. He said someday someone might come asking about Chicago, about 1932, and if they did, I should listen to them. He opened the box. Inside were letters, documents, and another copy of the 1932 photograph. Dad didn't talk much about his childhood in Chicago, Daniel continued. He was only 12 when they left, but when I was about 16, I asked him why we used Coleman instead of Harris. He sat me down and told me the story. Daniel pulled out the photograph. Dad said his father witnessed a murder. 2 police officers beating a store owner to death over a property dispute. Dad said his father tried to report it, but the police came to their house instead. They tied up his father and told the family that if anyone spoke about what they'd seen, the whole family would disappear. Marcus and Patricia exchanged glances. James Harris had tried to report the crime. Dad said a photographer was supposed to come that day for a family portrait. They'd saved for months to afford it. The police made them go through with it, made them smile and pose like nothing was wrong. Dad remembered his mother squeezing his shoulder so hard it hurt, telling him without words to stay calm. Daniel's voice thickened with emotion. He said the photographer was a brave man. He somehow captured what was really happening without the police noticing. After the photographer left, the police told them they had 1 week to leave Chicago. If they were still there after that, or if they ever came back, they wouldn't survive. So they went to Detroit, Patricia said. My grandmother had a cousin there. They packed what they could carry and took a night train. Dad said they left everything behind. Furniture, photographs, his grandfather's tools, his mother's wedding china, everything. And they changed their names, Marcus added. My grandmother's maiden name was Coleman. They started using it as soon as they got to Detroit. They were terrified the police would track them down. Daniel pulled out a yellowed letter. This is from 1935. My grandfather wrote to a friend who was still in Chicago asking if it was safe to come back. The friend wrote back saying the police were still asking about them, still making threats. They never returned. He showed them more documents, letters, news clippings his grandfather had saved about the Samuel Green murder case going cold, articles about police corruption in Chicago during that era. My father said his dad carried guilt his whole life, Daniel said. He witnessed a murder and couldn't get justice for the victim because doing so would have meant death for his own family. He chose his family, but it haunted him. Patricia spoke gently. Your grandfather did what he had to do to protect you all, and the photographer, Elijah Morrison, made sure the truth was preserved. We found his records, his notes about that day. Daniel looked up sharply. The photographer kept records? He kept everything, Marcus said, including the original negative, and he wrote about what he witnessed. He understood exactly what was happening. Daniel sat back, absorbing this. Dad said we should keep the photographs safe, because someday the truth might matter. I never really understood what he meant. I thought it was just an old family picture. Marcus showed him the enhanced digital version they had created, pointing out the mirror's reflection, the police vehicle visible through the window, all the details Morrison had carefully captured. Your grandfather's hands were bound in this photograph, Marcus explained, but your grandfather and Morrison found a way to document it that the police didn't see. This is evidence of what happened. Daniel stared at the image for a long time. My whole life, I knew there was something in our family history, something painful. My father would get quiet whenever Chicago came up. He never went back, not even to visit. He looked at Marcus and Patricia. What happens now? But what do we do with this? We tell the truth, Patricia said. We document what happened to your family. We expose the corruption that forced them out. We honor their survival. Daniel nodded slowly. I have something else. He went to another room and returned with a journal. This was my grandfather's. He started writing in it after they moved to Detroit. I've never shown it to anyone. Marcus opened the journal carefully. The first entry was dated July 1932. We have been in Detroit for 1 month. The children are adjusting, though Robert still has nightmares. Ruth cries when she thinks I cannot hear. I close my eyes and see Samuel Green's face as those men beat him. I hear his cries for help. I tried to do the right thing, tried to report what I saw, and they came for my family instead. What kind of justice is this? What kind of country? Marcus spent 2 weeks in Wisconsin, carefully photographing every document in Daniel's possession. The journal was particularly revealing. 40 years of James Harris's private thoughts, written under the name James Coleman, documenting his family's life in exile and his struggle with what he had witnessed. One entry from 1945 stood out. Robert came home from the war today. He fought for this country, wore the uniform, saw friends die on foreign soil. And I have never told him the full truth about why we left Chicago. How do I explain that the same system he fought to defend is the system that terrorized us? That the badge and uniform that should mean protection meant threat and violence for us? He is proud of his service, and I will not take that from him. But the irony breaks my heart. Patricia, meanwhile, had made a breakthrough in Chicago. Using the names Marcus had found in the property records, the 3 police officers who had owned Southside Development Corporation, she had traced their careers. 2 of them rose through the ranks, she told Marcus over the phone. One became a police captain, retired in 1955 with full honors. Another became a precinct commander. The third left the force in 1935 under unclear circumstances. And the murder of Samuel Green, Marcus asked, officially remains unsolved. But I found something in the alderman's papers. He died in 1960, and his estate donated his files to the city archives. Buried in there is correspondence about the State Street matter and relocating the Harris problem. They documented their own crime, Marcus said incredulously. Arrogance, Patricia replied. They never thought anyone would look, or that it would matter if they did. Back at the museum, Marcus worked with a forensic photograph analyst to examine every detail of the Morrison photograph. The analyst was able to enhance the image of the police vehicle visible through the window, revealing a partial license plate number and the insignia of the Chicago Police Department's 3rd District. The 3rd District, Patricia noted, covered the Bronzeville area in 1932, and guess who was a sergeant in the 3rd District in 1932? She pulled up a personnel record. Officer Frank Walsh, the same Frank Walsh who was listed as part owner of Southside Development Corporation. They were building a case across time, not for prosecution, as everyone directly involved was long dead, but for the historical record, for truth. Marcus reached out to Thomas's daughters in Detroit. Both were in their 60s now, and both remembered their father speaking vaguely about trouble in Chicago, but never with specifics. Dad said his father made them promise never to go back. One of them, Lorraine, told Marcus. He said Chicago wasn't safe for people named Harris. I thought it was just old family paranoia, you know? But I guess there was a real reason. Dorothy's children in Cleveland had similar stories. Their mother had been only 5 when the family fled Chicago and remembered little, but she had passed down a sense of fear connected to that city, a warning to stay away. We're spread out now, Dorothy's son Michael told Marcus. Wisconsin, Detroit, Cleveland, and I think some cousins in California. But we all carry this thing, this shadow. Nobody ever explained it, but we all felt it. Marcus realized the trauma had rippled through generations. Children and grandchildren who had never known the specifics still carried the weight of their family's terror, expressed as vague warnings and unexplained anxieties. He began working on a comprehensive report documenting everything they had found. Patricia helped compile the evidence, the photograph with its mirror revelation, Morrison's journal entries and business records, James Harris's personal journal, the property records showing police ownership of the development company, correspondence about forcing the Harris family out, newspaper articles about Samuel Green's unsolved murder. This is bigger than one family, Patricia said as they worked. This documents a pattern. Property theft through violence, police corruption, the systematic terrorizing of black families who witnessed crimes or refused to cooperate. This happened hundreds, maybe thousands of times. Marcus nodded. And most of those families never had an Elijah Morrison to document what happened. Most of those stories are lost forever. They decided to hold a press conference at the museum. Marcus contacted major newspapers and local television stations. He reached out to academic journals and historical societies. This story needed to be told widely. Daniel agreed to come to Chicago for the announcement, bringing his father's journal and the family's documents. It would be the first time anyone from the Harris family had returned to Chicago in 92 years. I'm nervous, Daniel admitted to Marcus on the phone. It sounds stupid. Everyone involved is dead, but I'm still nervous. It's not stupid, Marcus assured him. Your family was terrorized here. That fear doesn't just disappear because time has passed. Will you be there? Daniel asked. When I arrive, I mean. I'll be there, Marcus promised. You won't face the city alone. Daniel arrived in Chicago on a gray December morning. Marcus met him at Union Station, the same station where James Harris had likely departed 92 years earlier. Daniel stood on the platform for a long moment, looking around as if expecting ghosts. My father took a train from here, Daniel said quietly. He was 12 years old, leaving the only home he'd ever known, terrified he'd be killed if he stayed. Marcus didn't rush him. They stood together as travelers bustled past, the modern city carrying on around them, unaware of the history being confronted on that platform. Finally, Daniel nodded. Okay, I'm ready. They drove to the museum first, where Patricia was waiting. She had prepared a small private exhibition in a back room, a timeline of events, enlarged copies of the photograph showing the mirror's reflection, Morrison's notes, and excerpts from James Harris's journal. At the center was a map of Bronzeville in 1932, with pins marking key locations. The Harris home, Samuel Green's store, Morrison's photography studio, and the 3rd District Police Station. Daniel walked slowly through the exhibition, reading everything, studying the photographs. He stopped in front of his grandfather's journal, displayed open to the first Detroit entry. He was a good man, Daniel said, his voice thick. He carried this burden so his children wouldn't have to. And then his children carried it anyway, just not knowing exactly what they were carrying. Patricia had invited Lorraine and Michael, the descendants of Thomas and Dorothy. They arrived that afternoon, meeting Daniel for the first time, cousins united by a shared history they were only now fully understanding. I always felt like something was missing from our family story, Lorraine said, looking at the photograph. Like there was a blank space nobody wanted to talk about. Now I know why. Michael stood in front of the map, tracing the short distance between the Harris home and Green's store. 4 doors down. He was just a neighbor who wouldn't sell his property, and that got him killed. And your great-grandfather witnessed it, Patricia explained gently. He tried to do the right thing, tried to report what he saw, and it nearly got his whole family killed. That evening, Marcus took them to Bronzeville. Much had changed in 92 years. The old Black Belt had been transformed by urban renewal and demolition. The address where the Harris family had lived, 3247 South State Street, no longer existed. The building had been razed in the 1950s, replaced eventually by a community center. But they stood on the approximate spot, and Daniel pulled out a printed copy of the photograph. "This is where it happened," he said. "Right here, my grandfather stood with his hands tied, forced to smile while police officers who had murdered a man stood watching. Samuel Green's store was gone too, replaced by a newer building, but the lot was identifiable. They stood there as well, Michael placing flowers on the sidewalk. For Samuel Green," he said, "who deserved justice and never got it." The next morning, the museum held the press conference. The room was packed with journalists, historians, and community members. Marcus and Patricia presented their findings, walking through the evidence methodically. They displayed the photograph, pointing out the mirror's revelation. They showed Morrison's records and James Harris's journal entries. They connected the dots to the police corruption and property theft. Daniel, Lorraine, and Michael sat at the front table. When Marcus invited them to speak, Daniel stood. "My grandfather died in 1955, he began, his voice steady but emotional. He never got to come back to Chicago. He never got to clear his name or seek justice for what happened to his family. He lived for 23 years in exile using a different name, always afraid." He held up the photograph. "But he kept this picture. And my father kept it. And I kept it. We kept it because somewhere, deep down, we knew it mattered. We knew the truth was in there, waiting." Lorraine spoke next. "Our families scattered across the country, carrying pieces of a story we didn't fully understand. We grew up with shadows and silence, with warnings about Chicago that didn't make sense. Today, we finally understand why." Michael's voice was quiet but firm. "Samuel Green deserves to be remembered. Not just as a victim, but as a property owner, a businessman, a man who stood his ground and paid with his life. And the men who killed him, who terrorized my family, they need to be named. Their corruption needs to be documented." Patricia announced that the museum would be mounting a full exhibition on the case, examining not just the Harris family's story, but the broader patterns of police corruption, property theft, and violence against black families in 1930s Chicago. She had already been contacted by other families with similar stories, incidents buried by fear and time. The press conference made national news. The story of the photograph, with its hidden revelation in the mirror, captured public attention. But Marcus was careful to keep the focus on what the photograph represented: systemic injustice, a family's survival, and the power of preserving truth, even when it seems hopeless. In the days following, Marcus received hundreds of emails and calls. Other historians shared similar cases they had documented. Descendants of other displaced families reached out, wondering if their own family mysteries might have similar roots. A civil rights organization offered to help research other cases of police corruption and violence in that era. Daniel stayed in Chicago for a week. He and Marcus visited the Chicago History Museum, where other photographs by Elijah Morrison were housed. They found 3 more portraits of Bronzeville families, and while none contained the dramatic revelation of the Harris photo, Marcus now looked at them differently, wondering what other stories might be hidden in the backgrounds and reflections. On Daniel's last evening in the city, Marcus drove him to the lakefront, where they sat, watching the water as the sun set. "Thank you," Daniel said finally, "for seeing what no one else saw, for caring enough to investigate, for giving my family's story back to us." "Thank you for trusting me with it," Marcus replied. "Your grandfather's courage, your father's trust in keeping that photograph safe, your willingness to come back here, that's what made this possible." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I feel lighter somehow. Like a weight I didn't know I was carrying has been lifted. Is that strange?" "Not at all," Marcus said. "You were carrying your family's secret pain. Now it's been spoken, acknowledged, witnessed by others. That changes things." As they watched the city lights begin to glow in the deepening dusk, Marcus thought about all the stories still hidden, all the photographs still waiting to reveal their secrets, all the families still carrying unspoken trauma. But tonight, the Harris family's story had been told, and that mattered. 3 months after the press conference, the Disabled Museum opened its exhibition, Hidden in Plain Sight: The Harris Family Photograph and the Stories We Almost Lost. The centerpiece was the 1932 photograph, displayed alongside the enhanced version highlighting the mirror's reflection. Visitors could compare the 2 images, experiencing the shock of discovery that Marcus had felt that October morning. The exhibition drew thousands of visitors in its first weeks. Marcus often stood quietly in the gallery, watching people's reactions. He saw the moment when they noticed the reflection, the way their faces changed from curiosity to horror to understanding. The photograph had become more than just evidence. It had become a teaching tool, a reminder to look closer, to question what seems normal, to remember that images can lie even as they tell truth. But the exhibition included much more than just one photograph. Patricia had curated a comprehensive exploration of Black life in 1930s Bronzeville, the vibrancy of the community, the businesses and churches and social networks, and the constant threat of violence and displacement that hung over it all. Samuel Green was given a prominent place, his life and business documented, his murder examined in detail. The 3 police officers who had been part of Southside Development Corporation were named publicly for the first time: Frank Walsh, Thomas Brennan, and Joseph Kelly. Their careers were documented, their rise through the police ranks, their retirement with honors. The exhibition asked uncomfortable questions. How many other crimes had they committed? How many other families had they terrorized? How had the system protected them? Elijah Morrison was honored as a hero, a man who had used his art to preserve truth when speaking it directly would have been fatal. And Marcus had worked with Clara Morrison to compile a broader retrospective of her grandfather's work, showing how he had documented Black Chicago with dignity and precision, leaving a visual record that challenged the racist narratives of his era. And the Harris family was presented not as victims, but as survivors. James Harris's journal entries, selected carefully by Daniel for their strength and insight, showed a man wrestling with impossible choices, protecting his family while mourning the justice he couldn't obtain. Photographs of the family in Detroit, Robert in his Army uniform, Dorothy singing in the church choir, Thomas graduating from high school, demonstrated the life they had built after exile. The exhibition traveled. Detroit hosted it at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. Cleveland's Museum of Contemporary Art showed it. Madison, Wisconsin, near where Daniel lived, gave it space at the Wisconsin Historical Society. At each location, more families came forward with their own stories of displacement, violence, and survival. An unexpected development came from the Chicago Police Department. The current superintendent, responding to public pressure, announced a review of historical cases involving police misconduct. The Harris case and Samuel Green's murder were officially reopened as cold cases. While prosecution was impossible with all parties deceased, the department issued a formal apology to the Harris family and acknowledged the corruption that had pervaded the force during that era. "It doesn't change what happened," Daniel said at the ceremony, "but it acknowledges the truth. That matters." Lorraine, Michael, and Daniel had become close during the months since the discovery. They organized a Harris family reunion, the first in generations, bringing together descendants from across the country. Cousins who had never met gathered to share stories, to fill in the blank spaces in their family history, to connect the fragments into a coherent whole. At the reunion, held in Chicago in the spring, more than 50 Harris descendants attended. They stood together at the location where 3247 South State Street had once stood, and Daniel read from his grandfather's journal. Then they walked to the site of Samuel Green's store, where a historical marker had been installed. On this site stood Green's General Store, owned by Samuel Green, 1876-1932. Mr. Green was murdered during a property dispute. His death went unprosecuted due to police corruption. This marker honors his memory and acknowledges the injustice done to him and his family. Marcus attended the reunion as a guest. Watching the family together, multiple generations united by truth rather than divided by silence, he felt the profound importance of what had begun with one overlooked photograph. Patricia pulled him aside at one point. "We're getting requests from other museums, other cities. They want to know how to look at their own photographic archives differently, what to look for, how to investigate." "Good," Marcus said. "There are hundreds of photographs like the Harris image out there. Thousands, maybe. Evidence hiding in plain sight." A filmmaker had contacted him about making a documentary. A playwright wanted to adapt the story for the stage. A novelist asked for permission to write a fictionalized version. Marcus carefully considered each request, always consulting with Daniel and the family, ensuring their story would be told with integrity. The academic response was equally significant. Marcus and Patricia co-authored a paper on the case, published in the Journal of African American History. Other scholars began reaching out, sharing their own discoveries of hidden evidence in historical photographs. A new field of inquiry was emerging: forensic historical photography, examining old images with modern technology to reveal suppressed truths. On the one-year anniversary of his discovery, Marcus returned to his office, where it had all begun. The photograph still hung on his bulletin board, though now it was famous, reproduced in textbooks and documentaries. But Marcus kept the original print, the one he had scanned that October morning, when he had no idea what he was seeing. He thought about James Harris, standing in his living room with his hands bound, forced to participate in a facade of normalcy while his world collapsed around him. He thought about Ruth Harris, gripping her children, silently screaming through her smile. He thought about the children, Robert, Thomas, and Dorothy, who carried that terror into their new lives, who never fully escaped what they had witnessed. And he thought about Elijah Morrison, A photographer who saw injustice and found a quiet way to fight back, who positioned a mirror at just the right angle and preserved truth for a future that would finally be ready to see it. Marcus's phone rang. It was Daniel. "I wanted you to know," Daniel said. "We've established a scholarship fund, the James Harris Scholarship for students studying history, photography, or journalism, for people who want to uncover hidden truths." "That's perfect," Marcus said. "It's because of you," Daniel said. "Because you looked closer, because you cared enough to investigate. That photograph sat in archives for decades. You're the one who saw it." "I was just doing my job," Marcus said. "No," Daniel replied firmly. "You were bearing witness, just like Morrison did, just like my grandfather tried to do. You're part of this story now, part of how truth survived." After they hung up, Marcus sat for a long time in the quiet of his office. Outside, Chicago carried on, a city built on layers of history, some celebrated, some suppressed, all real. Somewhere in this city, and in thousands of cities like it, were more photographs, more documents, more evidence waiting to be seen. The Harris family photograph had taught Marcus a fundamental truth, that history is not just what is recorded, but what survives despite attempts to erase it. Sometimes that survival happens accidentally, through an overlooked detail or a careless mistake. But sometimes it happens because someone, a photographer, a family keeping a picture, an archivist willing to look closer, refuses to let truth disappear. Marcus turned to his computer and opened the database of the museum's photographic collection. Thousands of images awaited digitization and examination. He thought of Clara Morrison's words about her grandfather. Being a photographer meant bearing witness. And he thought being a historian means the same thing. He opened the next folder and began to work. There were more stories waiting to be found, more truths hiding in plain sight, more families whose silenced voices deserved to be heard. The Harris photograph had waited 92 years to reveal its secret. Marcus wondered what other secrets were waiting, and he resolved to keep looking, to keep bearing witness, to keep searching for the truth that survives in shadows and reflections, in the margins and backgrounds of history, until finally it can step into the light.